The first strike should have ended everything. I remember thinking that with absolute certainty as the sky over Kafi collapsed into fire. The assault began before sunrise, executed with such precision that even our predictive models had failed to simulate it. Orbital batteries opened in perfect synchronization, saturating the fortress valley with enough energy to liquefy stone, fracture bedrock, and erase anything that dared call itself alive. There was no warning, no hesitation, no error margin. It was, by every metric I had spent 300 cycles refining, a flawless opening move. And yet, the humans did not run. That was the first detail that did not make sense. From my observation post embedded within the Coalition command vessel, I watched the bombardment tear across the valley where the human fortress had been carved into the mountainside. Structures folded inward, defensive emplacements vanished beneath cascading fire, and entire sections of terrain simply ceased to exist in any recognizable form. The energy output readings spiked past thresholds that would have sterilized most known biospheres. The analysts around me began preparing their reports before the final volleys had even landed, already classifying the engagement as concluded. But the human comms channels did not go silent. They did not flood with panic either, which would have at least been understandable. Instead, what filtered to the interference was something disturbingly controlled, voices issuing instructions, confirming positions, adjusting timings. Not retreat orders, not evacuation calls, coordination. Residual signal noise, one of the officers muttered beside me, dismissing it with practiced ease. I said nothing, but I did not look away, because the fire was still falling. The second wave struck deeper, targeting the internal structures we had mapped through weeks of reconnaissance. It was designed to collapse underground networks, crush bunkers, and suffocate anything that had survived the initial impact. The kind of layered destruction that left no room for error, no pocket of resistance, no possibility of recovery. It was not an attack meant to win a battle. It was an attack meant to erase the idea of resistance entirely. And still, the human signals continued. That was when the unease began. Not because I believed they could survive. That would have been irrational. But because they were behaving as if survival was not the point. The patterns in their transmissions were too clean, too structured, too deliberate for a force that had just been subjected to planetary-scale annihilation. They were not reacting to the attack. They were following something. I requested a deeper scan of the valley. At first, there was nothing but heat distortion and debris fields, the aftermath of a perfectly executed strike. But as the thermal interference began to settle, faint signatures started to emerge. Not many, not enough to suggest a functioning defense, just enough to suggest presence. Impossible, someone whispered behind me. I did not respond, because the ground itself moved. Not from impact, not from delayed collapse. From beneath, sections of the shattered valley floor shifted with unnatural precision, sliding apart in ways that revealed not destruction, but design. Hidden structures unfolded from beneath layers of rock that had been deliberately sacrificed. Pathways opened where none should have existed. Heat-resistant plating peeled back to expose intact corridors, untouched by the bombardment above. The fortress had not been destroyed. It had shed its skin. And then, for the first time since the assault began, the human spoke clearly over open comms. Not a distress signal, not a plea. A single transmission, broadcast wide enough that even our encrypted channels caught it. Timing confirmed. Phase 2 begins now. Around me, the command deck fell silent, because the bombardment had just ended, and whatever the humans had been waiting for had finally arrived. For several seconds after the transmission, no one on the command deck spoke, as if the entire coalition had collectively decided to wait for reality to correct itself. It did not. The silence stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable, then long enough to become dangerous, because in that quiet, the implications began to settle in. They had expected the strike, not in a general sense, not as a vague anticipation of attack, but in the precise, measured way one prepares for a scheduled event. The timing, the sequencing, even the depth of the bombardment seemed to align with whatever plan the humans had already put into motion. That was the only explanation that fit the evidence, and it was not an explanation anyone wanted to accept. They got lucky, one of the senior tacticians said finally, his voice tight with forced confidence. Some of their lower levels survived the blast radius. It happens. No one challenged him, but no one looked convinced either. Because luck does not reorganize terrain. Luck does not produce synchronized communication after total saturation. And luck does not announce something called Phase 2. I forced myself to focus, pushing aside the instinctive discomfort and returning to what I had always relied on: patterns, data, and behavior. If the humans had prepared for this, then there had to be signs. There were always signs. No strategy emerges fully formed without leaving traces in the decisions that came before it, which meant the errors we had documented were not errors. I pulled up the pre-assault reconnaissance logs, overlaying them with the current sensor feed. The valley we had targeted had been studied extensively, mapped down to structural density variations and thermal anomalies. We had identified weak points, exposed infrastructure, and inefficient defensive placements. The consensus had been unanimous: the humans had built poorly. Now, looking at it again, I felt something cold settle behind my thoughts. Those weak points were the only places that had fully collapsed. Every structure we had classified as inefficient had absorbed the brunt of the strike, channeling the energy exactly where it would do the least damage to whatever lay beneath. The outer defenses had not failed. They had been designed to fail first. Even the angles of the artillery impact patterns, which we had considered optimal, now looked guided. We had not broken their defenses. We had followed them. I leaned closer to the display, isolating one of the sectors where the bombardment had been most concentrated. The surface layer had been obliterated, but beneath it, something remained intact. Not randomly, not partially, intact in a way that suggested shielding far beyond what we had believed the humans capable of deploying at this scale. "How long?" I asked quietly, not realizing I had spoken aloud until several heads turned toward me. "Observer," the commander prompted. "How long would it take?" I clarified, keeping my voice steady, "to construct a secondary defensive network beneath a structure designed to be sacrificed?" The question lingered in the air, unanswered, because it was a wrong question. The right one came a moment later. Why would they want us to hit those positions? No one answered that either. The command deck shifted from confidence to calculation in a matter of breaths. Orders were issued, not to advance immediately as planned, but to reassess. Additional scans were requested. Drone units were deployed ahead of the main ground force, instructed to verify structural integrity and confirm the absence of active resistance. That hesitation cost them more than they realized, because the drones did not report back the way they were supposed to. The first feed came through cleanly enough, showing a corridor carved into the exposed substructure. It looked empty at a glance, the surfaces scorched but intact, the layout simple and direct. Too direct, the kind of path an inexperienced force might take without questioning. Then the signal distorted, not abruptly, not as if something had destroyed the drone, but gradually, like interference building in layers. The visual feed fractured into overlapping frames, each slightly out of sync with the last. The audio channel picked up something faint beneath the static, a rhythmic pattern, almost mechanical, but not quite. Signal degradation, the operator reported, already attempting to compensate. "Boost the relay," the commander ordered. They did. The feed stabilized for exactly 1 second. Just long enough to show movement where there should have been none. Not an ambush. Not an enemy force waiting in position. The corridor itself shifted. Panels slid into place from angles that had not existed in the original structure. Sections of the pathway sealed behind the drone while new routes opened ahead, guiding it forward in a way that felt disturbingly intentional. It was not being trapped. It was being directed. "Pull it back," someone snapped. The command came too late. The feed cut, not with violence, but with finality, as if whatever system had taken control had simply decided the observation was no longer necessary. The remaining drones hesitated at the edge of the breach point, awaiting new instructions that did not come quickly enough, because in that moment, the realization spread through the deck with a clarity that no one could ignore anymore. The humans were not defending a position. They were controlling the battlefield, and we had just stepped exactly where they wanted us. I felt it then, unmistakable and unwelcome. Not fear, not yet, but the distinct, growing awareness that we had misunderstood the nature of this engagement from the very beginning. Because if this was only Phase 2, then the real question was no longer how the humans had survived the bombardment. It was what they had been preparing us for next. The order to advance still came. It had to, Momentum is a force unto itself in warfare, and the coalition had already committed too much to hesitate now. Entire fleets had repositioned, supply lines had been stretched across systems, and the political cost of retreat, especially against a species still considered unproven, was unacceptable. Even with uncertainty creeping through the command deck, the logic remained the same. Press forward, secure the valley, eliminate resistance. So the ground forces moved. At first, everything unfolded exactly as predicted. Armored divisions descended into the shattered basin, their formation tight and disciplined, supported by aerial units scanning for movement. The terrain was still unstable from the bombardment, but nothing that trained forces could not navigate. The breach points we had opened led directly into the exposed substructure, offering what appeared to be a clear path toward the fortress core. And for a brief, deceptive window of time, it worked. Units advanced without contact. No resistance. No traps. No defensive fire. The absence itself became the first warning. Maintain pace. The field commander transmitted, though I could hear the tension beneath the command. They are regrouping deeper inside. That explanation spread quickly through the ranks, accepted because it was familiar, because it fit the expected pattern of a battered enemy falling back to defensible positions. It was comforting in its predictability. It was also wrong. The first disruption came from the outer flank. A reconnaissance unit reported loss of visual contact with its adjacent squad. Not destroyed, not engaged, simply gone. Their transponders still registered, but their positional data began to drift in ways that did not align with the terrain mapping. At first, it was dismissed as sensor error, residual interference from a bombardment. Then it happened again, and again. Entire sections of the formation began reporting inconsistencies. Units that should have been within direct line of sight could not see each other. Pathways that had been mapped minutes earlier no longer aligned with real-time scans. Corridors branched where there had been none. Others narrowed unexpectedly, forcing troops into tighter formations. "Update the map," the commander ordered. "We are," came the strained reply. "It keeps changing." I watched the data streams overlay and re-overlay themselves, each new scan contradicting the last. The structure beneath the valley was not static. It was dynamic, shifting in response to movement, adjusting pathways with deliberate precision. But the most disturbing part was not the movement itself. It was a pattern. Every alteration pushed the advancing forces deeper, not into dead ends, not into obvious kill zones, into convergence. "They are channeling us," I said quietly, the realization settling with uncomfortable clarity. No one responded immediately, but I saw the commander's posture shift, his focus sharpening. "Define," he demanded. "They are not blocking advance routes," I continued, forcing myself to stay analytical. "They are removing alternatives. Every structural change reduces lateral movement and increases forward flow. They are not slowing us down. They are guiding us." "Guiding us where?" someone asked. I did not have an answer. Not yet. The first real engagement came moments later, and it was nothing like the models had predicted. A forward unit encountered resistance at what appeared to be a junction point, an open chamber where multiple corridors intersected. Human defenders emerged from concealed positions, engaging at close range with controlled bursts of fire. The coalition troops responded instantly, their superior numbers and firepower overwhelming the resistance within seconds. It was efficient, clean, exactly what we had expected from the beginning, and completely meaningless, because the humans did not hold a position. They abandoned it, not in retreat, not in panic, but in perfect synchronization, disengaging just as quickly as they had appeared. The coalition forces pushed forward, securing the chamber, reporting it as cleared. Then the next unit encountered the same thing. And the next. Short, violent engagements. Human defenders appearing just long enough to inflict minor disruption, then vanishing before decisive force could be applied. It was not enough to stop the advance, not even enough to slow it significantly, but it was enough to shape it. They are testing response times, I realized aloud, measuring reaction speed, adjusting engagement distance. "Why?" the commander pressed. "Because they want us to keep moving," I said. The words felt wrong even as I spoke them, because no defensive doctrine supported that conclusion. No rational force facing superior numbers would encourage deeper penetration into its own structure, unless the structure itself was a weapon. Reports began flooding in from multiple sectors now, each echoing the same pattern. No sustained resistance. No attempt to hold ground. Just constant, controlled contact designed to maintain pressure without breaking momentum. The coalition forces advanced faster, driven by the illusion of progress, by the belief that victory was just beyond the next corridor. And with every step, their formations stretched thinner. Supply lines extended. Communication delays increased. Units became isolated from immediate support, though not enough to trigger full withdrawal protocols. It was subtle, gradual, intentional. "They're separating us," someone whispered. "Not entirely. Just enough." I pulled up the broader tactical overlay, watching as the advancing forces formed long, narrowing paths through the shifting structure. What had begun as a unified front was now fragmenting into multiple spearheads, each pushing deeper along routes that no longer intersected cleanly, each believing they were the closest to the objective. "They're not just guiding us," I said, the final piece falling into place. "They're dividing us." The command deck fell silent again, but this time it was not confusion that held them. It was a slow, creeping realization that the humans were not reacting to the battle. They were shaping it. And then, as if to confirm the worst possible interpretation, a new transmission cut through the interference. Clear, unfiltered, deliberate, convergence points established. Maintain pressure. Do not break flow. The voice was human, calm, almost conversational. And for the first time since the assault began, I felt something that had no place in a tactical assessment. Because whatever waited at the end of those converging paths, we were already too deep to avoid it. By the time the coalition command understood what convergence truly meant, it was already happening. The advancing spearheads, one spread across multiple corridors, began reporting increasing contact density. Not heavier resistance in the traditional sense, but more frequent intersections with other units. Pathways that had seemed isolated only minutes before started reconnecting in unpredictable ways, forcing separate divisions into shared spaces they had not intended to enter. At first, it appeared advantageous. Reinforced numbers, consolidated firepower, improved communication. On paper, it looked like the kind of battlefield correction commanders prayed for when operations became fragmented. Units that had been operating independently now supported one another, tightening their formation as they pushed deeper into the fortress interior. But the structure continued to shift, and every time it did, the points of convergence narrowed. Wide chambers became compressed corridors. Multiple access routes funneled into single passageways. The flexibility of movement that coalition forces relied on began to disappear, replaced by rigid channels that allowed only forward or backward motion. Lateral repositioning, once the foundation of their tactical superiority, became increasingly impossible. "They are compressing the field," I said, my voice quieter now, not from uncertainty, but from understanding. The commander did not look away from the display. "To increase engagement efficiency." "No," I replied, "to remove choice." That distinction mattered more than anyone wanted to admit, because without choice, strategy becomes reaction. And reaction can be predicted. The first major loss confirmed it. A heavy assault division, one of the most resilient units in the coalition force, reported contact in a narrowing corridor where three paths had merged into one. Human defenders appeared ahead, engaging with controlled fire, just as they had before. The coalition response was immediate and overwhelming. They advanced, pushing the humans back, forcing them into what looked like another tactical withdrawal. Then the corridor sealed behind them. Not completely, not obviously, just enough. Support units attempting to follow encountered structural resistance where none had existed moments earlier. Reinforcement slowed. Communication lag increased. The forward division, still advancing, did not realize they had been isolated until it was too late. The humans did not attack immediately. They waited. That was the part that unsettled me most. They allowed the division to move deeper, to commit fully, to stretch itself into a position where retreat would be difficult and support would be delayed. Only then did the environment change again. Side panels shifted open, revealing concealed positions. Overhead structures reconfigured, altering sight lines and cover. And then the humans struck, not as a scattered force, not as desperate defenders, as something coordinated, disciplined, focused. The engagement lasted less than 4 minutes. When it ended, the coalition division was gone, not driven back, not broken, removed, the data feed cut with a finality that left no ambiguity. Signal loss across all units, no retreat markers, no survivors broadcasting, just absence. They sacrificed the outer layers to build this. I murmured, almost to myself. The commander finally turned to me. Explain. The surface structures, I said, pulling up earlier scans. Everything we destroyed in the bombardment. It wasn't just defense. It was scaffolding, cover for what they built underneath. This entire substructure isn't a fallback position. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, because saying it out loud made it real. It's a controlled environment. No one argued, because the evidence no longer allowed for denial. The fortress was not a place the humans were trying to protect. It was a system they were using to shape the battle, and the coalition forces were inside it. Reports from other sectors began reflecting the same pattern. Units advancing, converging, compressing, then disappearing. Not all at once, not in catastrophic losses that would trigger immediate withdrawal, but in calculated reductions, enough to weaken, not enough to alarm, not until it was too late. Why not eliminate us faster? One of the officers demanded, frustration breaking through the tension. If they can do this, why not collapse the entire structure and be done with it? Because they don't want us gone, I said. That answer drew silence again, heavier this time. They want us here, I continued, forcing the logic into words. They need us committed, moving forward. If they destroy us too quickly, the operation ends. If we withdraw, the operation fails. They are maintaining a balance, keeping us engaged, keeping us invested, keeping us inside. Inside what? That question hung unspoken, because none of us wanted to answer it. The coalition commander's posture shifted, subtle but unmistakable. The confidence that had defined the opening of the assault was gone, replaced by something colder, more cautious. Reinforcements, he ordered. Push additional units through all active breach points. Maintain pressure across every corridor. If they want us committed, we'll give them more than they can handle. It was a logical response. It was also exactly what the humans were counting on. I saw it the moment the order was given, not because I could predict the outcome, but because the pattern had already been established. Every decision the coalition made, every adjustment, every escalation, it all fit within the structure the humans had created. They were not reacting to our strategy. They had already accounted for it. And somewhere, deeper within that shifting maze of steel and stone, something continued to run on a timeline we did not understand. Because this was not about holding ground. It was not about winning a battle. It was about time. And the most dangerous realization of all was beginning to take shape in my mind. Whatever the humans were buying with that time, it was worth everything they were losing to get it. It took exactly 3 more lost divisions for the coalition to realize the truth. Not because the evidence had been unclear before, but because no one had been willing to interpret it correctly. Losses in warfare were expected. Attrition was part of the calculation. Even unexpected resistance could be rationalized within existing doctrine. But this was something else. This was controlled disappearance. And control implied intent. I isolated the telemetry from the last vanished unit, replaying the final seconds before signal loss. There was no catastrophic spike in energy, no massive detonation, no sudden collapse of the structure, just a narrowing corridor, a shift in formation, and then silence. But just before the feed cut, there was something else. A signal, not coalition, not interference. Human. It was faint, buried beneath the noise, but unmistakable once identified. A localized transmission voice, tightly contained, occurring at the exact moment the unit reached what I now recognize as convergence threshold. I pulled up the previous losses, aligning their final coordinates. The pattern emerged immediately. Every vanished division had crossed a specific boundary, not a physical barrier, not a visible structure, a line, invisible in the terrain, but consistent across every engagement. They are not eliminating us randomly. I said, my voice sharper now. They are removing units at fixed intervals. There's a grid, a sequence. The commander stepped closer to my station, his earlier confidence replaced by focus intensity. What kind of sequence? I expanded the overlay, projecting convergence points across the entire substructure. At first, it looked chaotic, a scatter of engagements across a shifting battlefield. But as I filtered out the noise, isolating only the confirmed losses, the chaos resolved into something far more precise. A shape, a pattern drawn not with lines, but with absence. They are building something, I said. The words felt absurd, even as the data supported them. Building what? The commander demanded. I don't know, I admitted. But it's not defensive. It's not reactive. Every loss, every engagement, it contributing to a larger configuration. The realization hit me with a force that made my thoughts stutter. They're using us, not just as an enemy force, as components. The silence that followed was no longer confusion or disbelief. It was something heavier, something closer to dread. Because if that was true, then the scale of what the humans were doing extended far beyond the immediate battle. They are shaping the battlefield at a structural level, I continued, forcing the logic forward. Every movement we make, every position we occupy, it's feeding into a system we don't understand. Then we stop moving, one of the officers snapped. Pull back, regroup. No, the commander cut in sharply. All eyes turned to him. If we withdraw now, we abandon the objective, he said, his voice controlled but unyielding. We leave the fortress intact. Whatever they are building, we give them time to complete it. He looked at me then, not as an observer, but as something closer to an equal. Tell me, he said, if we keep advancing, what happens? I hesitated, not because I lacked data, but because the conclusion felt wrong. We accelerated, I said finally. Whatever process they're executing, it depends on our movement. The faster we push, the faster it progresses. And if we slow down, they adapt, I replied. They've already demonstrated dynamic control of the environment. They'll adjust pathways, force engagement, maintain pressure. We can't disengage cleanly anymore. We're already inside the system. The commander's gaze hardened. Then we finish it, he said. The decision rippled through the command deck. Orders transmitted with renewed urgency. More units were committed. Additional breach points were opened. The advance intensified, no longer cautious, no longer measured. If the humans wanted momentum, the coalition would give them a flood. I watched it happen in real time. For a moment, it looked like overwhelming force might break the pattern. The sheer volume of troops pushing into the substructure disrupted the clean sequencing I had identified earlier. Engagements overlapped. Pathways became congested. The careful control the humans had maintained began to strain under the pressure. Then the structure changed again. Not subtly this time. Not gradually. Entire sections of the substructure shifted in rapid succession, corridors realigning with mechanical precision, sealing some routes while expanding others. The battlefield reconfigured itself to absorb the influx, redistributing the advancing forces across new vectors. The pattern did not break. It expanded. They anticipated this, I whispered. Of course they had. Every escalation, every adjustment, every attempt to disrupt their control, it all fit within the framework they had already established. The humans were not reacting to the coalition's decisions. They were incorporating them. The shape I had identified began to evolve, the grid extending, filling in new sections as additional units crossed the convergence thresholds. What had once been scattered points of loss now formed a cohesive structure, something vast and deliberate taking form beneath the valley. And then, for the first time, I understood what we were looking at. Not a trap, not a defensive system. A machine, not mechanical in the traditional sense, but functional all the same. A system designed to process movement, position, and presence into a specific outcome. The substructure, the shifting corridors, the controlled engagements, they were all components of something larger. And we were inside it. What is it doing? The commander asked, his voice lower now, as if speaking too loudly might somehow accelerate the process. I did not answer immediately, because the data I was seeing did not align with any known military objective. Energy readings began to spike across the convergence points, not from weapons fire, but from something deeper within the structure. The pattern we had mapped was not just spatial. It was active. "They are powering something," I said slowly. The words settled over the command deck like a physical weight. "With what?" someone asked, though I could hear the answer forming in their voice before I spoke it. "With us." The implications unfolded in rapid succession, each one more unsettling than the last. The human fortress was not simply holding against a coalition assault. It was using it. Every unit that advanced, every position occupied, every engagement fought, it all fed into the system, not as fuel in the conventional sense, as input, as if the presence of the coalition forces themselves was required to complete whatever process the humans had initiated. "That's not possible," one of the analysts said, but the protest lacked conviction. Nothing about this had been possible, until it was. I traced the energy spikes across the grid, watching as they converged toward a central point deep within the structure, a point we had not yet reached, a point that had remained untouched by the bombardment, untouched by the advancing forces. Protected, hidden, target that location. The commander ordered immediately. "All units redirect. Break the pattern. Hit the core." The command went out across the battlefield, a desperate attempt to disrupt the system before it could complete whatever function it had been designed for. For a moment, it seemed like it might work. Units began shifting toward the identified point, abandoning the established pathways, forcing movement across the structure in ways the humans had not previously allowed. The pattern faltered, the clean convergence lines breaking under the strain of redirected force. Then the humans spoke again. Not to us, to each other, but the transmission was wide enough for us to hear. "Core deviation detected," the calm voice said, the same one that had announced the beginning of Phase 2. "Adjusting flow." The structure responded instantly. Corridors collapsed. New pathways opened. The redirected units found themselves funneled back into the pattern, their attempted deviation absorbed and corrected with ruthless efficiency. The machine did not break. It adapted, and the energy reading surged. I stared at the data, at the converging lines, at the central point that pulsed with increasing intensity, and felt the final piece of understanding settle into place. "They're almost done," I said. No one asked what done meant, because whatever it was, we had just helped them complete it. The moment the system surged, everything changed. Until then, the battlefield had felt controlled, almost clinical in its execution, as if the humans had been carefully managing every variable, every movement, every loss. But now the pattern tightened, and with it came something new, urgency, not from the coalition, not from the chaos of combat, but from the structure itself, as if the entire fortress had reached a threshold it could no longer maintain indefinitely. "They're accelerating," I said, my voice quieter than before, not out of uncertainty, but because the realization demanded it. The energy spikes were no longer isolated events. They pulsed in rapid succession across the grid, each convergence point flaring to life in a cascading sequence that fed toward the hidden core. The machine, the only word that fit anymore, was no longer assembling. It was activating. "Push everything forward," the commander ordered, his restraint finally breaking. "All remaining forces, full advance. We end this now." There was no hesitation this time. The coalition forces surged with renewed aggression, abandoning caution entirely. Formations compressed, units overlapped, and the carefully structured advance devolved into a flood of bodies and firepower driving toward the center. For the first time since the assault began, it felt like the coalition was no longer being guided. It felt like they were breaking free. For exactly 40 seconds. Then the humans changed the rules. The structure did not shift gradually anymore. It moved violently, entire sections reconfiguring in seconds, corridors folding and expanding with brutal efficiency. Pathways that had allowed rapid advance collapsed inward, forcing the coalition units into tighter, denser formations. The battlefield constricted, compressing thousands of soldiers into spaces designed for hundreds. "They are forcing density," I realized. "They need us closer." "For what?" someone demanded. I did not answer, because I was already watching it happen. The first synchronized detonation did not come from coalition weapons. It came from the structure itself. A convergence point flared with sudden intensity, the energy spike peaking beyond anything we had recorded so far. Then, without warning, the entire section collapsed inward, not as an explosion, but as a controlled implosion that folded space, matter, and everything within it into a single point before releasing it outward in a shockwave that tore through adjacent corridors. The units caught inside did not have time to react. They simply ceased to exist. What was that? The commander snapped. I forced my focus back to the data, replaying the sequence. It wasn't an attack, I said, the words feeling wrong even as I spoke them. It was a cycle, a completion event. A what? The system reached a threshold. I explained, the logic forming even as I struggled to accept it. Enough units within a convergence zone. Enough density. Enough input. It triggered the next phase. And the result is total annihilation, one of the officers asked. No, I said, because the energy readings told a different story. It's transfer. The word hung in the air, incomprehensible and yet impossible to ignore. Transfer to where? The commander pressed. I tracked the energy flow again, watching as the output from a collapsed convergence point did not dissipate randomly. It moved, directed, pulled toward the central core like a current flowing into something vast and unseen. Not where, I said slowly. To what? The realization hit the command deck like a physical blow. They are not just eliminating us, I continued, my voice tightening. They are converting us. Every unit, every engagement, every position, it all feeds into that core. That's not possible, someone repeated, but the protest was weakened now, hollow. Neither is any of this, I replied. Another convergence point flared. Another implosion. Another surge of energy feeding into the system. The pace increased. The battlefield transformed into something unrecognizable, no longer a war zone, but a processing field where movement itself became dangerous. Coalition units tried to pull back, to disengage, but the structure no longer allowed it. Retreat paths sealed. Forward routes narrowed. The only direction left was deeper. They are trapping us in the cycle, I said. We're part of it now. The commander's expression hardened, but there was something else there now, something that had not been present before. Out! Find the core, he ordered. We break everything. I focus on the central point, isolating its coordinates, projecting the fastest possible routes. There, I said, marking the path. But it's shifting. Of course it was. Even the core was not fixed. It moved within the structure, adjusting its position relative to the flow, staying just beyond direct reach while maintaining control of the system. They are protecting it, the commander said. No, I corrected. They are timing it. Because the energy levels were still rising. Whatever the system was doing, it was not complete yet, and that meant the humans were still holding back something. As if to confirm the thought, a new signal cut through the chaos. Not from the battlefield, from within the structure itself. A human transmission, clear and deliberate. Final threshold approaching. Maintain compression. Do not allow dispersion. The voice was the same as before, calm, controlled, utterly devoid of panic. But there was something new beneath it now. Strain, not weakness. Pressure. They are running out of time, I said. The commander turned to me sharply. Oh, we are. I did not answer, because both possibilities led to the same conclusion. The system was nearing completion, and whatever happened when it finished, there would be no stopping it. Another convergence point flared. Another section of the battlefield vanished. The energy surge spiked higher than ever before, feeding into the core in a pulse that made the entire structure tremble. I stared at the data, at the accelerating cycle, at the narrowing window between activation events, and felt something I had not experienced in all my cycles of observation. Not fear of defeat, but fear of understanding too late. Because the pattern was no longer just building. It was counting down, and whatever the final phase was, we were about to become part of it. The countdown did not appear on any display. It did not need to. By now, every officer on the command deck could feel it in the rhythm of the battlefield, in the shrinking interval between convergence events, in the way the structure pulsed like something alive and nearing its final breath. The machine beneath the valley had reached a state where nothing could be mistaken for coincidence anymore. Every movement had consequence. Every second had weight. And the coalition was still inside it. Core vector locked, I said, forcing my focus onto the one variable that still mattered. If we commit everything along this axis, we can reach it before the next cycle completes. The commander did not hesitate this time. There was no room left for caution, no strategic advantage left to preserve. All units, he transmitted across every active channel, his voice cutting through the chaos with cold authority. Full commitment. Break formation. Push for the core. Ignore all secondary objectives. It was a desperate order. It was also the first one the humans had not anticipated in advance. For a fraction of a moment, the pattern fractured. Coalition forces surged in a direction that did not align with the established flow. Units abandoned the guided pathways, forcing movement through unstable sections of the structure, collapsing walls, cutting through segments that had not been designed for transit. The system reacted immediately, corridors shifting, barriers forming, but the sheer mass of the advance created something the humans had not relied on until now. Chaos. And chaos, unlike controlled movement, was harder to shape. "They are losing control," one of the officers said, a fragile edge of hope breaking through. I wanted to believe it, but the data told a different story. "They're adapting," I replied, my voice steady despite the tightening pressure in my chest. Because even as the coalition forces broke from the pattern, the structure responded with increasing aggression. Entire sections collapsed to block the advance, forcing units into narrower channels, accelerating their movement rather than stopping it. The system no longer guided gently. It forced. The closer they pushed toward the core, the more violent the environment became. Energy spikes intensified, convergence points forming faster than ever before. Units attempting to reach the central zone were caught in partial cycles, sections of their formations vanishing mid-advance as the system triggered prematurely under the strain of disruptive flow. "They are accelerating the process to compensate," I said, "if we don't reach the core in the next interval." I did not finish the sentence. I did not need to, because the next convergence event was already building. The energy readings climbed higher than any previous cycle, the entire grid lighting up in a cascading surge that made the earlier activations look insignificant by comparison. This was not another step in the process. This was the final one. Distance to core, the commander demanded. I recalculated, adjusting for the shifting structure, the collapsing pathways, the accelerating cycles. "Too far," I said. The words landed like a verdict. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the commander made a decision. "Redirect the spearhead," he ordered. "Concentrate all remaining forces at the nearest convergence cluster. Overload the system. If we can't reach the core, we break the cycle." It was the last viable option. If the system depended on controlled input, then overwhelming it might force a failure. It was also exactly what the humans had been preventing until now. Coalition forces shifted again, abandoning the direct push of the core and instead converging on the nearest active node. The density increased rapidly, units compressing into a single zone, pushing past structural resistance, ignoring losses, driving toward a point that pulsed with unstable energy. "This will trigger a full cycle," I warned. "Good," the commander said. "We want it to break." But as the forces converged, as the density threshold approached, something unexpected happened. The system slowed. Not stopped, not failed. Slowed. The energy spike plateaued, holding just below activation levels, as if the machine itself had recognized the overload attempt and adjusted its parameters to prevent it. "That's not possible," one of the analysts said, disbelief breaking through. "It is," I said, my voice quieter now, because I understood. "They are not just running the system," I said. "They are controlling the thresholds." The humans had never lost control. Not even now. Especially not now. A new transmission cut through the battlefield. Clear, focused, and for the first time, directed at us. "You're close," the human voice said, calm despite the chaos surrounding it. "Closer than anyone else has ever been." The command deck froze. The commander's expression hardened. "Identify the source." I was already tracing it, following the signal back through the shifting structure, through layers of interference and distortion, toward the central point we had been chasing since the beginning. "I have it," I said, and for the first time, the core resolved on the display. Not a weapon, not a reactor, not anything we had expected. A chamber, small compared to the scale of the system around it, contained, deliberate, and inside it, a single human, standing at the center of the convergence grid, surrounded by interfaces that pulse in synchronization with the entire structure. The voice came again, softer now, but no less steady. "You weren't supposed to see this part." The commander leaned forward, his focus locked on the image. "What is this?" The human tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question. Then he answered. "Proof," he said. "Proof that you can't outcalculate something that's willing to pay any price." The energy level spiked again, higher than before, the final threshold. "You wanted the core," the human continued. "Now you have it." I felt it then. Not fear, not confusion, but the absolute certainty that we had misunderstood the nature of this battle in the worst possible way. Because the system was not just a machine. It was a choice. And the humans had already made it. The commander's voice cut through the silence, sharp with urgency. "All units, disengage. Full retreat. Now!" But the structure did not open. The pathways did not clear. The battlefield did not release us, because the cycle had already begun. And this time, it was not going to stop. The final surge did not come with an explosion. It came with silence. For one impossible instant, the entire battlefield, every weapon discharge, every collapsing corridor, every screaming transmission, cut out as if reality itself had been muted. The data streams froze mid-update. The energy readings plateaued at levels that should not have been sustainable, and the vast machine beneath the valley reached a state that was neither motion nor stillness. It was completion. I remember thinking, with a clarity that felt almost attached, that this was what the humans had been building toward all along. Not victory in the conventional sense. Not survival. An outcome. And then the core activated. The chamber at the center of the structure did not erupt outward. It folded inward, pulling the entire energy network toward a single point where the humans stood. The grid we had traced, the convergent zones, the vanished units, the escalating cycles, all of it collapsed into a unified flow that converged on him as if he would anchor the entire system. For a fraction of a second, I expected destruction. Instead, I saw transformation. The energy did not disperse. It did not detonate. It stabilized, compressing into a control field that radiated outward in a way that passed through the entire structure and through every coalition unit still inside it. The effect was immediate. Weapons failed. Power systems shut down. Communication arrays dissolved into static. But it was not random disruption. It was precise, targeted, selective. "They are not destroying us," I whispered, the realization settling with a weight that no calculation could have prepared me for. "They're removing us." Across the battlefield, coalition forces began to vanish, not in violent bursts, not in catastrophic implosions like before. They simply ceased to occupy space. One moment they were there, fighting, advancing, resisting, and the next they were gone, as if the system had decided their presence was no longer required. The grid was clearing, not because it had failed, because it was finished. I tracked the data as it collapsed inward, watching the energy signatures stabilize into something far more controlled than the chaotic surges that had defined the earlier phases. The machine was no longer processing input. It was executing output. And whatever that output was, it extended far beyond the fortress. "External sensors," I said sharply, forcing myself back into function. "Pull system-wide scans." The command deck scrambled to comply, redirecting sensors away from the collapsing battlefield and out into the surrounding system. The results came in fragments at first, then with growing clarity. The coalition fleet, thousands of vessels positioned in orbit, began to flicker on the display. Not under attack, not under fire. They were phasing. Sections of the fleet vanished in synchronized intervals, entire squadrons disappearing without debris, without energy spikes, without any measurable transition. It was not destruction. It was removal on a scale we had never conceived. "They are projecting it outward," one of the officers said, his voice hollow with disbelief. Yes, I replied, because the pattern was unmistakable. The system we had been fighting inside was not the weapon. It was the ignition sequence. They needed us, I said, the final understanding locking into place. Our movement, our density, our presence inside the grid. It was required to complete the field. To do what? The commander demanded. I looked at the data, at the disappearing fleet, at the emptying battlefield, and answered with the only conclusion left: to redefine the battlefield itself. The human voice returned, not over open comms this time, but through every channel simultaneously, bypassing encryption as if it had never existed. Calm, measured, unstoppable. You came here to break us, he said. To overwhelm, outnumber, outlast. You thought this was a fortress. A brief pause. It isn't. The remaining coalition forces inside the structure, those not yet removed, began to fall back, not by command, but by instinct. But there was nowhere to go. The pathways no longer mattered. The structure was dissolving, its purpose complete. This was a boundary, the human continued, a line you weren't supposed to cross. The commander clenched his jaw, forcing himself to respond. What have you done? For the first time, there was something in the human's voice that almost resembled emotion. Not anger, not triumph. Resolve. We ended the possibility of this war the only way you would understand, he said, by making it impossible for you to continue it. The last of the coalition units inside the grid vanished. The battlefield emptied. The structure collapsed, not violently, but quietly, its purpose fulfilled, its components retracting into nothingness as if they had never existed at all. The valley above settled, the shattered terrain smoothing into stillness under a sky that no longer burned. And in orbit, the fleet was gone, not destroyed, not scattered, gone, removed from the system entirely, as if it had never entered. The command deck fell into a silence deeper than anything that had come before, because there was nothing left to process, nothing left to calculate, nothing left to predict. The humans had not won the battle. They had ended it. I looked at the final data logs, at the absence where an entire military force had once existed, and felt something I had never experienced in all my cycles of observation. Not fear, not awe, understanding, because this had never been about strength, not in the way we measured it. The humans had taken every disadvantage, numbers, firepower, positioning, and turned it into a requirement. They had built a system that only worked if the enemy committed fully, if they advanced, if they believed they could win. They had weaponized certainty, and when the coalition gave them exactly what they needed, they ended the game. The humans' final transmission came quietly, almost as an afterthought. You can send your reports now, he said. Tell them what you saw. A pause, then, softer, and tell them not to come back. The signal ended. The system remained silent, and for the first time since the assault began, there was nothing left to escalate, nothing left to reveal, nothing left to fight. Only the question that lingered in the empty space where an entire war had just been erased. If this was what humanity could do with one fortress, one commander, one moment of preparation, then what would happen when they decided not to wait for the enemy to arrive at all?